In this video, I'm going to go through the anatomy of the skull. You can try to follow along with the diagrams in your workbook. So the skull is basically subdivided into the cranium, which is formed by 8 bones kind of protecting the brain. And in addition to that, there are also 14 other facial bones. With the exception of the mandible here, which is your lower jaw, all the skull bones are joined together by these immovable joints called sutures. So here you can see one sutures here, and there is another sutures. They're called sutures because they kind of resemble stitches. So your cranium, as I said, has 8 bones to it, and they are the frontal bone here, right at the front. You have 2 parietal bones, right? They are actually named after the lobe of the brains that they are protecting. So parietal bone. Here there is one sphenoid bone. Right? Sphenoid bone is right there, right? If you stare at the hollow socket of the skull, you'll be looking directly at the sphenoid bone. You can see it on the side as well. There are going to be 2 temporal bones, one here, as well as the occipital bone at the back, and finally we have an ethmoid bone there. So those are the 8 bones that forms the cranium. So why don't we go ahead and label that first? Okay, so over here I'm going to put a label there. This is going to be your frontal bone. Okay, and the frontal bone, as you can see, actually forms the top of your eye socket as well, right? So your eye socket, where your eyeballs goes, actually is formed by seven different bones. Okay, so you probably should know what they are. The superior side of your eye socket, or your orbit, they're called, is formed by the frontal bone. So you only have one frontal bone. Okay, now if we go to the side here, right, you will see that that is the parietal bone. So I'm going to go ahead and label that for you, the left parietal bone, and on the other side, of course, we are going to have the right parietal bone. Okay, so I'll just leave that alone. So the parietal bone will join at the top here, right, with this fissure, right, and below this fissure is where you would expect to find the longitudinal fissure that separates the left-right hemisphere. Sorry, I meant this is the suture, not the fissure. Below it would be the longitudinal fissure. Now, the parietal bones will join with the frontal bone here with another suture. Okay, let's take a look at another bone that makes up the cranium, and that is this bone right here at the back. That is, of course, the occipital bone, right, named after the lobe that it protects, the occipital lobe. Now there is only one occipital bone, and it kind of forms like a U shape, if you would, right, that goes under your skull like that. And at the bottom of it, you can see that there is an opening. There's an opening. So this opening is where your spinal cord will come out, right? Well, technically is where the medulla oblongata will come out as the spinal cord, right? I'm going to go ahead and try to put a label there. That is going to be part of the occipital bone. And that opening there is called a foramen. You might remember foramen means a hole. Foramen magnum. Foramen magnum. There you go. So, oh, that didn't work. Let me see. Let me try that one more time. That is going to be foramen. There we go. Foramen magnum. Okay, and again, that's just referring to the hole over here. Now, flanking the hole on either side are these kind of knuckle-like structure, right? They were kind of like these semicircle knobs that you have on both sides. There's one of them, and to try to rotate this a little bit, you can see there is another knob there. So these knobs actually will connect with the first bone of your backbone to allow you to kind of nod your head. Okay, the ability to nod your head is because of these two structures connecting with the first bone of your backbone. And these knobs, they are called occipital condyle. Occipital condyle. So you have two of them, okay, and they are on the either side of your foramen magnum. Okay, so another bone that forms your cranium would be the temporal bone. Right? So there is one temporal bone here. Right? Let me put a label for you. Temporal bone. Now you can see the temporal bone. You have two of them, one on each side. Temporal bone forms your ear canal, right? So over here, that hole there, that's where your auditory canal, ear canal is going to be. Of course, you cannot see the ear here, right? Because ear is made up of cartilage, and so we're looking at the bones here. That's why you don't see that ear. If you kind of take your finger and touch the back of your ear, you will feel a knob. That knob is this knob right here. Okay, so the temporal bone, you have two of them. Next, we have the sphenoid bone. Okay, so sphenoid bone is kind of like the cornerstone of the skull, right? It is where every other bone is going to be connected to, except for the mandible. Okay, and you can see it starts on one side, goes through the middle of the skull, and then it goes to the other side. All right, let me try to isolate this one for you. There you go. So it's like a butterfly-shaped bone, right? And again, it spans the entire interior of the skull. Now you can see that there are two openings here, right? These two openings are where the optic nerve is going to go through. From the back of the eye, right, and then it's going to, of course, cross over in the optic chiasma. Now, if you look at the sphenoid bone here at the side, from the side, you can see that there is a groove here, right? So this groove is actually where the pituitary gland is going to sit in. Okay, so there is your sphenoid bone. Let me try to go back to the whole skull, right? And I am going to put a label for you right there. Right, sphenoid bone. Another bone here. Oh, sorry. Let's go back to the sphenoid bone a little bit for a little bit first. The sphenoid bone actually makes up the back of your eye socket, right? As you can see, right? It makes up the back of your eye socket. Let's see. If I rotate it over here to the side, right, you will see another bone here. Another bone right there. That is the ethmoid bone. Right? There's only one of them, right? And it's you can see it forms part of your nasal septum, and over here you can see it forms the medial side of your eye socket, right? The middle side of your eye socket, right? And that is another bone that is part of the cranium. Okay, so let me put another label there for you, the ethmoid bone. Okay, in front of the ethmoid bone, we have actually, before we talk about what's in front of the ethmoid bone, all the bones here, the 8 bones that I've shown in this diagram so far are all the bones that makes up your cranium. I just reset the skull. We finished talking about cranium. Now let's look at some of the bones that makes up the facial bones. Right. So highlighted here is the maxilla. So the maxilla forms the upper jaw right here, and it forms the socket for your teeth to go in as well. And you can see the maxilla actually also forms the lower floor, inferior floor of your eye socket. You might also remember. Let me try to isolate the maxilla here for you. If I take everything else away and I kind of rotate it, you can see the maxilla forms the front roughly two-thirds of your heart palate. Okay, so that is your maxilla, right? Part of your facial bone. Let's see. We have the mandible here. The mandible, right? The mandible forms your lower jaw. It is the only bone that is not connected to your sphenoid directly. And here you can see the mandible actually connects with your temporal bone to form the MT joint, right? The mandibular temporal joint, and this is the joint that allows you to chew your food. We also have another bone here, right? You remember this is the this is the ethmoid bone that we talked about earlier. Sorry, I'm having trouble selecting the ethmoid bone here. It seems. There is the ethmoid bone. It was not showing before. So in front of the ethmoid bone, you have the necromal bone. Okay, so there is the necromal bone, and you have two of them. This is the one on the right, and this would be the one on the left. Inside the necromal bone is going to be your tear duct, right? So you know, the tear is going to be able to run down through this duct, right? And sometimes it will drain into the nose. That's why we sniffle when we cry. And other bone that we're going to look at is the zygomatic, right here. The zygomatic, right? The zygomatic forms the prominence of the cheek. Cheek also known as the cheekbone, actually, and it forms the lateral side of your eye socket. And last but not least, you have your nasal bone here, right? Your nasal bone over here. That if you wear glasses, that's where your glasses is sitting on, right? Your nasal bone, right there. So those are all the bones that you have to know for the skull, right? We're going to be labeling this in the workbook next. Actually, before we go to label the skull in the workbook, let's go through the bones that makes up the eye socket one more time, right? So on the lateral side, we have the zygomatic bone. On the inferior side, we have the maxilla, and on the medial side, we have the necromal bone at the front, and we have the ethmoid bone in the back. Those together makes up the medial side of your eye socket, and the top of the eye socket is made up of the frontal bone. And then there is another one that's very tiny here. You can't really see it too well, but if I click on it, right, you see a little bit of it. That's actually your palatine bone. And if I rotate a skull like this, you can see the palatine bone. You might remember that from the digestive system. That it will fuse with the maxilla. Together, they form your hard palate. Okay, so let me try to isolate the palatine bone for you. There it is. You can see it's kind of like a U shape, right? And that little knob there is where it's going to help form your eye socket. Now, if you could turn to page 68 of your workbook, we can label this skull together. Page 68. So I already colored this bone here. That is your frontal bone. Frontal bone, and that forms the top of your eye socket, right? So this whole thing here, A, is pointing at the eye socket. And there are 7 bones that forms the eye socket. So this is also called the orbit. Orbit. Okay. So I'm gonna put a little star here to note that this is a bone that forms the eye socket. Okay, put a star here as well. We have another one here that is the maxilla, right? Maxilla, maxilla bone, and it forms the inferior side of your eye socket, right? I'm gonna put a star there, as well as it forms your upper jaw and the sockets for your upper teeth. We have another one here, right? This one right there. This is your zygomatic bone. Right? Zygomatic bone forms the prominence of your cheek, right, which is this area that I'm coloring right now, and it also forms the lateral side of your eye socket. So zygomatic bone. Right, so that's also eye socket. Put a star there for you. You cannot really see the ethmoid bone here too well from the lateral side, but you know it's going to be along with the lacrimal bone. They're going to form the medial side of your eye socket. So I'm just gonna put those bones here, right? Lacrimal, and then ethmoid. Okay, you can see part of the ethmoid here though. Okay, so that actually is part of your nasal septum, and it's going to be created by the ethmoid bone. Okay, so that's part of the eye socket as well. Now I know it doesn't seem like it here, but remember the ethmoid bone actually extends all the way up here, and it's going to be part of the medial side of your eye socket. Okay, I can just quickly go back to the 3D model for you to see, to take a look. So this here is your ethmoid bone, and you know if I rotate at the front, you can see it also forms part of your nasal septum, right? So in our diagram here, right, this part, this purple part here is basically this part that I'm pointing at right now. Okay, so it forms the nasal septum as well as the medial side of your eye socket. What else do we have here? We have your sphenoid bone. So the sphenoid bone, you can see it forms the back of your eye socket, right? Remember, it's kind of like that butterfly shape bone, right? If you don't remember, just scroll back earlier in the video to see the model again, and that would be letter D. Okay, sphenoid bone. Okay, I'm not sure why it is bolded like that, but I'm going to put a star there because it's also part of your eye socket. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bones so far for the eye socket, and there is a 7th one. You cannot see it in this diagram, but that would be the palatine, right? If you remember, just a couple minutes ago I told you that there's a little dot here, right? That would be where the palatine bone is, and it kind of forms a U shape, and the bottom of the U is where the hard palate is going to be. Just 2 more labels, I guess. Over here we have the nasal bone, right? Nasal bone, that's where your glasses would be sitting on. Nasal bone. Okay, and down here, this lower jaw, it is going to be called the mandible, right? Mandible, right? You remember the mandibular, submandibular salivary gland, right? That's going to be behind this bone here, and it forms your lower jaw. Mandible. And last but not least, you have 2 other bones here on the side. Just going to color them for you. That is going to be your temporal bone. Okay, so the temporal bone is where your ear canals are going to be found in. So there, that is the bones of the skull.